we will distill over 20 years of plant hunting in Asia into about 45 minutes. So you're going to see some highlights, but there's a lot you're missing, obviously. But basically, we're going to start in the Himalayas here and work our way east into China, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, and then end up down here in New Guinea. So way down, a couple years ago, I was about right here, almost to Australia. So that's basically the way you collect seed, like some of the berries, so you sit in your tent or your hotel room all night squishing berries and trying seed. And actually, recently, probably post-Pleistocene, Virea or tropical rhododendrons migrated into northern Queensland, Australia. So there are two species here now. It's a northern genus, but they've been migrating south and finding new habitats and niches and things. Anyway, let's get started here. So here we start in the Himalayas. This was a trip I took a bunch of tourists basically to see flowers last spring in Sikkim, Himalaya, which is an easy place to travel around in. Beautiful mountains up to 25,000 feet, lots of rhododendrons. Pretty interesting roads, of course. That's very common in that part of the world. So you're in four-wheel drives most of the time. And of course there are hazards. Landslides are a big deal in that part of the world. This was right before we went through on the road. They actually closed the road for a couple days and we got stuck behind the closure. And it actually made the news back here because one of my team members tweeted or emailed or something, and it made big news, foreigners trapped in the mountains. It wasn't really that big of a deal. But when you do get into the forest, you get some pretty amazing rhododendrons. This is Rhododendron arboreum, which is the common tree rhododendron. If you've ever seen pictures of Nepal or trekked in Nepal, the big trees with the pink and red flowers, that's arboreum. It's all through the Himalayas. They get quite large. That's my hat for scale. And you see a lot of diversity. So in the Himalayas, you get a lot of the big leaf species. And we grow a lot of these outside down at the garden. It's what we're seeing. We have a 3-acre woodland of big leaf rhododendrons. And the leaves will get about like that on some of them. And some species are quite diverse. Those are all different color forms of one species. And just some of the plants. This is Rhododendron thomsonii, cinnabarinum. That can be pure yellow, pure orange, pure red, purple, but always that tubular bell-shaped, beautiful plant. You get a lot of other interesting plants as well. This is Primula caudoriana, which is a very common primula in the Himalayas. And then Rheum nobile. This is a rhubarb, basically. So that's our Tibetan guide. And it was very hard to photograph that plant because they were common, but the guides were usually up front, and it's rhubarb, so they ate them. So really begged, please don't pick it for a minute. Let me get a photo. Then after we took a picture, he picked it and ate it. Yeah. Now we're moving east into northeastern India, and these are still relatively unexplored areas. That's one of the bridges you cross. This is in Naga rebel-controlled territory. So this took a couple of weeks just to get to the one mountain that I wanted to explore. This was back in 2003, but we were the first ones in and managed to be the first Westerners to climb the highest mountain in Asia, south of the Himalayas. So that was a great feat. And it's controlled by the rebel army, so at one point we had to negotiate with the rebel army with snipers pointing rifles at us the whole time. So it was quite a trip, yeah. That trip is written up on our website. You can read that. It was a very interesting trip. These are some of the people we negotiated with, the Nagas. These people were headhunters until the late 40s, after World War II, and then American Baptists moved in and converted them all, and they gave up the headhunting and the nakedness and the beer and all the good stuff. But, yeah. So this was the top of the highest mountain. I was quite surprised to find a big leaf rhodie, which occurred further down the slope, was on the very top at 12,500 feet. So most of the big leaf species are not hardy outside of our area. For instance, if you live back east, you can't grow any of them, which is a shame because it's beautiful foliage. This one, they're growing back east, so that was a really great new introduction. Another one, this is close to the border with Tibet. That's about a 5-minute walk across there. You have to be pretty careful. That's the Brahmaputra River. And those were our guides on that trip. These are the Mishmi people. That was another trips don't really work out, to be honest, because of bad weather or bad borders in this case, or they revoke your permits when you get there. It's kind of the Wild West, so you never know what's going to happen. But in this part of the world, there are a lot of agapetes, which is one of my subgroup specialties. These are basically epiphytic, which means grows on other plants over the trees, like ferns and orchids and things. These are fancy epiphytic blueberries, basically. So take a blueberry flower and expand it out and give it a bunch of color, and those are agapetes. We have a great collection of these. Most of them are in the conservatory down at the garden. Some are in bloom any time of the year. Yellow. This one has very large flowers that blooms in the autumn. And this one is close to a blueberry. That's one of my very favorites. Great foliage, bristly stems, beautiful little flowers, followed by white blueberries. So as you see, it's basically a blueberry. Yeah, there. And you get another one from Vietnam has white bells and then dark red berries that are not blue, but it looks like a cherry. Really great. I don't know. That hasn't been tested yet. Now we're moving out of the Himalayas into China, and as you all know, China's changed quite a bit recently, and you'd have a hard time finding the city on a map, and yet there's 1 million people there, and everything is lit up year-round, and lights on every building. It's amazing what they've done there. Of course, the best thing about going to China is the food. I love the real Chinese food. Everything's very fresh, as you can see here. Here's some cabbage out drying on the hedge in the parking lot, and you get away with it. It works. And of course, a lot of hot peppers, at least in the west and the north. So there were a few little slivers of pork in there with the garlic and peppers, but that's a pretty common dish. One of my favorites is fried hornet larvae. So these are seasonal, of course. You only get those in the autumn, but they go up and collect those out of combs up in the cliffs and stir fry them up with oil and garlic. It's actually quite good. Very expensive dish, but I'm not sure what that brown liquid is there. Now we're moving even further west. We're into Yunnan. This is on the Burma border. So believe it or not, this area, which is virgin, untouched forest, is right on where Tibet, Burma, India, and China come together. So 4 of the most densely populated places on the planet. Yet there's still, the trail ends right here, and there's nothing north of here. So it's incredible to think that a place like that still exists, especially in the midst of, 2.5 billion people. That's one of the trails along the Salween River. Unfortunately, the Chinese have 13 dams planned here, so everything we're looking at is going to be destroyed. But nowadays in China, it's even easier. You can literally shoot into China and be on a gondola the next day after arriving in the airport and be on the top of the mountain in an hour or so. So most, at least on the East Coast, where there are more people, most of the big famous mountains now have these gondolas up to the top. So it's quite easy to go in and really get to the good stuff quickly versus hiring ponies and trekking up for 4 or 5 days, et cetera, et cetera. Once you get up high enough, this is probably 13,000 feet, and you get some pretty big old rhododendrons. So that's a species that we struggle to grow. Our biggest one's probably about like that, 40 years old. So that's probably several hundred years old. More of the big leaves. This is a good hardy big leaf, Rhododendron rex, which means king. Great foliage, beautiful flowers, quite hardy. That'll get 40 feet high. Makes a nice statement in your garden. And a uniform forest. So here's a forest of Rhododendron breevii, which is a famous foliage plant. So pretty amazing things you find out there. This is very typical habitat, though, for the rhododendrons. This is a very famous yellow-flowered species, which is very hard to grow, unfortunately. Here you see it growing on basically a mossy cliff with running water nearby. So that's drainage. When they say drainage, that's what they're talking about. So it doesn't dry out ever, but also it's not sitting in water. So that's the thing we always stress when you're growing species, especially like rhododendrons, any plants really, to give them good drainage. So of course you can't mimic that at home, but it does give you an idea of the requirements. So on these trips, we've been able to introduce a lot of species into cultivation, which are now, at least least among species people commonly grown. This is Ocrazium, which is a beautiful red-flowered species. This is Gongshanensi, which is a completely new species that was just named by the Chinese. Beautiful foliage on that plant. Blooms in January. And Huianum, which is in April, which is one of my favorites. Very unique color with the big starry calyces. And those are retained on the plant after the flowers fall off, so you get this long season of color. And then there are even new species that nobody's ever collected before, which I've collected a half a dozen or so of those. This is one. So nobody had ever found this and made a herbarium specimen or introduced it or anything. It does not have a name yet, but there are still things out there. In 2005, we found a 100-foot tree rhododendron, a whole grove of them, in an unexplored part of northeastern India. So think of that, there's a tree rhododendron, 100 literally, 4 guys couldn't put our arms around them. And nobody had ever seen it before. So there's a lot of material out there still. This is a Chinese salal. The fruit is much more attractive. That's Baltheria forestii. And this is another Chinese salal. This one is a little bit tender, and we grow it in the conservatory. But look at the foliage on that. If that had any hardiness, that would be a very popular plant. They grow it down in California with great success. Another Agapetes. This is one of my favorites. This one I grow outside. Great flowers. And you get a lot of primulas. So there are hundreds of species of primula. Native, wherever you find rhododendrons, you find primula, basically. And this is one we grow in the garden. That's just coming into bloom now, actually. Primula secundiflora. Magnolias, this is Siboldiae. Most of you know Magnolia Siboldiae, Wilsonii, they're kind of the same thing. That's it in the wild. Of course, a lot of Erasemas, probably 100, 150 species of Erasema in Asia. And species peonies, it's another love of mine. This is Peonia marii, which hopefully some of you are growing. We've been selling that for quite a few years. Brought that back in '95, and we do it from seed, but it's a woodland peony. So you don't put it out in the sun. You put it in with trilliums and ferns and hostas, and it does very well. Gentians are also another large genus. This is Gentiana sinoornata. And some of the poppies. So this is Meconopsis integrifolia, which is called the yellow lampshade poppy. Now we grow the Himalayan blue poppy with some success, which I'll show you in a bit. But I have, actually nobody can really grow this one. In Scotland they do okay with it. It's cooler. Places like that, Norway, Alaska, does very well with this, but we cannot keep this alive on our farm for some reason. Too bad. The flowers literally are about that big. Yeah, stunning thing. The last few years I've been focusing on eastern and central or even southern China, which your diversity of species dissipates quite rapidly, but those areas have not been explored before, so you have a good chance to find something new to cultivation. In other words, it's never been brought back into our gardens or even new to science. So places like Guangxi, that's a very famous tourist area, but you go up in the hills there and there are a lot of great species. And again, the great food, nothing like a good fresh pork chop. Hard to turn that down. But you know you had a good meal when you see something like that. A plastic table out on the sidewalk, good street food, flies crawling on everything. That's the really good stuff. Yeah. And if you do run into any problems, they have very good graphics. They're trying to get you through your mess. So. Now we're in Guizhou, and that's a Buddhist temple, very famous place. This was just opened up to Westerners about 10 years ago. About 30 species of rhododendron here. They're all over the cliffs. You can actually climb up there if you like. Great spot, yeah. But a lot of these rock fixtures up on the top of the mountain, which I don't know how those get through all the earthquakes they have there, but very famous place, beautiful stuff. And this is kind of, now we're getting into your classic Chinese scenes, such as you'd see on wall hangings and things like that with the spires and the conifers. This is a Chinese hemlock. And in this area you get rhododendrons, sorry, just put my tongue, staminium, just to show some of the diversity of rhododendrons. Most people would not recognize that, I think, as a rhododendron. And that blooms in June as well, which is really great and fragrant. Those are the fruit berries, so you sit in your tent or your hotel room all night squishing berries and running seed, and it's quite tedious actually. I always wish I had an intern. Anyway, there was another question? Yeah.